Our speaker is Marzena ZAWANOWSKA from the University of Warsaw, who did her degree here in Tel Aviv with partially with Meira, and whose book on the Yefet's commentaries on the Abraham sections of the book of Genesis is almost out. Is about to be.
Has been published, maybe even
these days.
As we speak, it may be. And Offer Roche Becker informed me that the book which the cover is is actually out also as well. So these are. It's a good week for charism. Anyway, Marzena will be talking about an overview of Yefet Ben Eli's studies.
Yes. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for taking care of us. It's really a pleasure to be here. And as you may see from the handouts, not only Yefet was prolific, but also the scholars writing about Yefet were very prolific. Of course, I will not talk about I will not mention all the works and all the articles, only the highlights and some conclusion, but still it will take me some time, so please take a coffee. Okay. One of the most prominent prolific Karaite commentators of the early classical period was Yefet Ben Eli, as you all probably know. We have over 740 manuscripts indexed by the Jewish National and University Library in Jerusalem, which are attributed to him. And Yefet's work is also a singular example in the history of Jewish exegesis of the Holy Scriptures of a continuous translation and commentary on the entire Hebrew Bible. You have a proof text from Simcha Lutzki, the hero of yesterday's session. Correct me if I'm mistaken, but as far as I know, remnants of all his commentaries on the Bible, including Lamentations, for some time considered lost, have survived to our time and been found and identified. About this Lamentation, I'm not sure, so please correct me if I'm mistaken. Yet, despite the vital role he played in consolidating classical Karaite exegesis and the major impact his work had on subsequent Jewish exegesis as a whole, over time Yefet gradually sank into oblivion among non-Karaite and, to a certain extent, even Karaite authors. There were complex reasons for this, most notably the Judeo-Arabic language in which his works were written. Some of the scholars, moreover, formulated the hypothesis that Yefet's achievements were disregarded because he was, and I quote, overshadowed by Sa'adia, the hero of the age. Be it as it may, this led over time to a general ignorance of his Bible exegesis and its significant contribution. I will give just one example. Spinoza, when referring to certain concepts related to the question of authorship of the Torah, promulgated initially by Yefet and apparently repeated by Abraham ibn Ezra, completely ignores the former and attributes them to the latter. Thus he states, and I quote, "Ibn Ezra was the first, so far I know, to treat of this opinion." Moreover, in some cases, scholars who ventured to study his works expressed generalizing or impressionable views and perceived Yefet as a mere compiler of previous exegetical achievements, as well as accused him of lacking originality. It may be due to the fact that Yefet himself, in almost every introduction to his Bible commentary, emphasized his in-depthness to the previous generations, but it should be rather understood as a rhetoric trope and not as a real statement. For example, Philip Birnbaum stated, and I quote, "It is safe to say that Yefet's Bible commentary is in the main a compilation into which the author has condensed the exegetic erudition of his predecessors." At about the same time, Lawrence Marwick expressed his appreciation for Yefet's commentaries as a source for the historical study of biblical exegesis, yet he was of the opinion that, and I quote, "on the whole, his voluminous commentaries composed in Judeo-Arabic vernacular show little originality." And similarly, Leon Nimoy admitted that Yefet's exegesis is not original with him, nor does he claim to be so. In fact, he leans heavily and admittedly on his predecessors. This view has been perpetrated by various encyclopedias. The Jewish Encyclopedia, for example, states, Yefet realized the importance of grammar and lexicography for the interpretation of scripture, although he did not excel in either. It's very young. The interest which his commentaries present lies chiefly in the accumulation of material for the history of the differences between the Rabbanites and the Karaites. I think this is really exaggerated statement. Even the Encyclopedia Judaica from the 70s, the first edition, denied the originality of Yefet's exegetical undertaking by affirming that, and I quote, Yefet, who relied mainly on early Karaite authorities, cannot be considered an innovator. Also, Encyclopedia Biblica, we have a source in Hebrew, deprecates Yefet's achievements, and I will just quote a short statement, פירושיו פשטנים ועיקר חשיבותם שהם מגלים לנו את היקף ידיעותיו בשטחים שונים. So, finally, in the works of some scholars, one can sense a traditionalist view of Judaism, which is ideologically antagonistic towards Karaite Judaism and influences the description of Karaite works as being somewhat less original or less inventive than their Rabbinite counterparts. By the same token, Yefet, who succeed more than any Karaite commentator of scripture in consolidating different exegetical traditions, was described as a mere compiler, or at most, and I quote, a storehouse of Karaite thought. This is Naftali Wider. An extreme example of underestimation of Yefet's achievements emerges from Simon Morris Lerman's article on Yefet. The author states, for example, and I quote, prodigious as his contribution to biblical research is, it would be hyperbolic to claim for him originality. He did not plough a lonely furrow even among his own sectarians. And I will come back to this article later on because it includes other far exaggerated opinions. For these and other reasons, it is only from the latter part of the 20th century that, aside from important critical editions of his works, scholars also began to show specific interest in Yefet's unparalleled exegetical achievements. In the first half of the 19th century, Karaism was studied as part of emerging academic sciences of religion and Semitic languages in general, including Jewish studies, the Wissenschaft des Judentums. And it was during this initial period that, for the first time, Yefet Ben Eli and his works aroused scholarly attention of Solomon Monk and Leopold Dukes. I'm not sure about the pronunciation of this name. Subsequently, during the course of the 19th century, the first still rather sporadic attempts were made primarily to edit and much less to analyze Yefet's text. And characteristically, if there were such attempts, they were usually made in Latin, probably also due to the fact that some of the scholars were priests, Christian priests, and so was at least Jean-Joseph Léandre Bargès, who edited three things: Yefet's commentary on Psalms 1 and 2, Yefet's translation of the entire book of Psalms, and Yefet's commentary on the Song of Songs. The first book of the Song of Songs was also the topic of Paul Achilles Jung, the father of a famous psychiatrist, Carl Gustav Jung, unpublished doctoral dissertation. And at about the same time, we have another work in Latin by Zacharia Auerbach, who edited Yefet's commentary on Proverbs 30. And also Robert Schroeter, please correct me if I'm mistaken, I'm not sure if he was Robert, because on his work you have only R. So I think he was Robert Schroeter, and he edited and translated into German Yefet's commentary on Yoel and Hosea. Whereas Adolf Neubauer prepared a tentative edition and English translation of selected passages from the exegete's commentary on Isaiah 52-53. At this early stage in the development of wide-ranging Jewish studies, the first major historical works concerning not only Jewish history in general, but also Karaite movement and its literary achievements in particular began to appear, and authors such as Heinrich Gretz and Julius Fürst devoted separate chapters exclusively to Yefet, his lives and oeuvre. Most importantly, at this time, Simcha Pinsker brought out his landmark anthology of Karaite text, Likutei Kadmoniyot, which also included a section of Yefet's texts. In the last 2 decades of the 19th century witnessed a slowly growing interest in Yefet and his works, which resulted in increased editing activity. There are still rather editions than studies of Yefet. We have Theodor Hoffmann, who published Yefet's commentary on Psalm 22. Klaas August Reinhold Tötermann presented an edition with Latin translation of Yefet's commentary on the first 2 chapters of Hosea. And few years later, an important English, for a change, translation of Yefet's commentary on the book of Daniel was prepared by David Samuel Margoliot. And in the following decade, we have also Hartwig Hirschfeld edition. It's a tentative edition of Yefet's commentary on Leviticus 23. He published it at least twice in 2 different articles. He also devoted a separate section to Yefet in his book on Hebrew grammarians and lexicographers. Then we have Israel Günzig, who edited and analyzed the first 3 chapters of Yefet's commentary on the Proverbs. And it appeared in Krakow, and it is noteworthy that this publication is among the first to include also an analytical section, a real study of Yefet's exegesis. We have also, from about this time, 2 annotated editions of Yefet's translations of Yoel and Amos, as well as Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, and Nahum, were prepared in Hungary, and I didn't see them, so I cannot describe them more thoroughly. In this period, Latin was already supplanted in the scholarly research by modern languages. The arduous editing enterprise continued towards the turn of the 20th century with the publication of tentative editions of brief excerpts from Yefet's commentaries, which appeared in several important articles by my compatriot Samuel Poznański, and in a book by Abraham Chaish, which presents an edition of Yefet's translation of Zephaniah, Haggai, and Zechariah. Hence, until the advent of the 20th century, a number of editions of Yefet's works were prepared, but almost no studies were devoted specifically to Yefet. The first half of the 20th century was marked by individual attempts to analyze Yefet's oeuvre. Simon Maurice Lehmann devoted his unpublished doctoral dissertation to Yefet's commentary on the book of Yoel, which he translated into English. Jacob Mann authored a premier work, Text and Studies in Jewish History and Literature, that came out in the 30s. And the second volume, entitled Karaite, contains a short biography of Yefet and an exemplary extract from his works. And in addition, Adolf Poznański made use of Yefet's commentary on Genesis 49:10 in his study of medieval messianic interpretation of this biblical passage. Concurrently, the editing process continued to bear fruit in the form of several publications, such as Nahum Schorstein's edition of Yefet's commentary on the first 2 chapters of Ruth, subsequently translated into Hebrew by Isaac Marcon and by mistake attributed to Salma ben Yeruchim. Or we have also Hartwig Hirschfeld publication of a commentary on Nahum. Towards the middle of the 20th century, an important pioneering, albeit still isolated, series of articles appeared about Yefet's exegesis, presented by Philipp Birnbaum. It accompanied his edition of the Book of Hosea, and notwithstanding its unquestionable value, this publication offers a somewhat tendentious and, I would say, incoherent evaluation of Yefet's exegetical undertaking, by claiming on the one hand that Yefet's work is in the main a compilation, and on the other hand, that if not for Yefet, there would be little left of Kimchi and Ibn Ezra. So this is slightly inconsistent to my view. At about the same time, Lawrence Marwick made an effort to systematize the data about the order of the books in the Bible Codex available to Yefet, in addition to preparing an important edition of Yefet's commentaries on the 6 of the minor prophets, Yoel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, and Micah, that unfortunately was never published. In the second half of the 20th century, new editions began to appear. We have Richard Bland, who devoted his doctoral dissertation to Yefet's commentary on Ecclesiastes 1-6, which he edited and translated into English. Ofra Cohen edited and translated into Hebrew and provided a linguistic analysis of his interpretation of Proverbs 10-12. And Philip David Ventkos edited a significant part of the exeget's commentary on the book of Jeremiah. But unfortunately, none of these editions has so far been published. It is also very characteristic or typical of the study of Yefet that many of the works devoted to him have never been published. I will skip. Neftali Wieder too utilized Yefet and his works as an important source for his groundbreaking research on the Judean scrolls and Karaism, which examined the similarities between the Karaites and the sectaries of antiquity, as well as certain messianic concepts of the early Karaite ideology. In this period as well, Simon Morris Lerman, already mentioned, made a rather disappointing attempt to reconsider Yefet in the broader context of biblical studies, and his article about Yefet's place in the history of Jewish exegesis is explicitly tendentious, as reflected in the author's immoderate praises of Rabbinic Judaism and open marginalization of the role played by the Karaites in general and Yefet in this case in particular. For instance, and I will quote, the author states, "Despite the many vagaries of Karaite ill-conceived doctrines, of a flypaper variety which attract everything that buzzes around until it is lured to its death, traditional Judaism owes much to Karaite scholars." And he also concludes, "It is only fair to admit that we, i.e. Rabbinite Jews, have built mightily on flimsy Karaite foundations." In addition, some of Yefet's writings were included in the leading anthology, English anthology of Karaite texts prepared by Leon Nimoy, who considered Yefet, though not without some reservations, by far the most eminent of the Karaite biblical commentators of the golden age of Karaite literature. In a similar vein, but in a much more decisive way, Moshe Sokolov, in his inspiring PhD dissertation, described this Karaite commentator as a thoroughly original exeget and devoted an entire chapter to Yefet's originality. The author claims, and I will again quote, "Superficially categorized by most early investigators as an eclectic, insufficient attention has been paid to Yefet's originality. To be sure, no exeget operates within a vacuum, and it would be idle to maintain that Yefet is devoid of the influence of his predecessors. There is, however, a clear line of demarcation between downright eclecticism, merely copying previous and sundry opinions, and an eclecticism which modifies them in part." It is worth noting that Sokolov studies among the first to fully focus on Yefet in an attempt to analyze and assess his exegetical achievements. And with few exceptions, most of the works devoted to this exeget and described above offer critical editions and or translations of selected portions of the biblical commentaries with relatively short analytical introductions, if any at all. Sokolov's work, moreover, heralded a shift which commenced to occur at the time in the way Yefet was perceived by the scholars less as a compiler and more as an original and innovative exeget. As part of his study, Sokolov edited and translated into Hebrew Yefet's commentary on Chazinu. He wrote also 2 articles which rely on Yefet or make use of Yefet. Also in the 70s, George Vaida studied Yefet's commentary on the book of Ecclesiastes. He also described several of Yefet's eschatological concepts, as well as his attitude towards certain rabbinic agadot. The question of exeget attitude towards Agadah was also addressed by Philip Miller, who made use of Yefet's commentary on Jonah to demonstrate that the Karaites were not always reluctant to employ certain rabbinic materials. Incidentally, in this article, the author announces that his intention is to publish the entire text of Yefet's commentary on Jonah with critical notes and translation in the near future, but as far as I know, it has never been published. At about the same time, Haggai ben Shammai edited and translated into Hebrew the first 5 chapters of Yefet's commentary on the book of Job as part of his master thesis, yet only his edition of Yefet's introduction and commentary on Job 1:1 had appeared in print published by Joshua Blau. Later on, these important biblical books became the subject of the unpublished, again, PhD dissertation of Haider Abbas Hussein. A vital contribution to the study of his exeget was made by Ben Shammai's doctoral thesis, unfortunately, again, as yet unpublished, which thoroughly analyzes inter alios Yefet's philosophical theological concepts on the basis of his biblical commentaries, and as far as I am aware, it is both the first and so far the unique work that offers an in-depth study of philosophical notions of early Karaites, Yefet and Kirkisani, especially Yefet and Kirkisani, with a possible exception of Daniel Lasker works and Colette Sirat, but Ben Shammai's thesis is really focused on Yefet and Kirkisani. So it's much more focused. Most importantly, the dissertation also includes a considerable number of critical edited texts from the commentaries on many different biblical books. In addition, Ben Shammai compiled a textbook comprising, among other things, selected passages from the previously prepared edition of Yefet's commentary on Ecclesiastes by Blunt. Moreover, he authored several articles that dealt with the different existing versions and adaptations of Yefet's commentaries, as well as the distinctive transmission and tradition detected in his Bible translations. Additionally, he wrote a number of articles in which Yefet's works, although not the main subject, constitutes a major source of comparative exegetical study. For example, his study of Karaite atomism, his analysis of polemical elements in Saadia theory of prophecy, his article on Kalam in medieval Jewish philosophy. Ben Shammai also used Yefet and his work as an important source while discussing the idiosyncratic Karaite concept of a biblical Mudawwin, including a comparative overview of its place in Judeo-Arabic exegesis and the possible influence of the writings of the Brethren of Purity on its development. Last but not least, Ben Shammai's entry in the new second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica testifies to the paradigmatic shift which has occurred in the recent decades in the scholarly study of Yefet, wherein he has ceased to be framed and described as a not too original condenser and adapter of previous exegetical achievements, and is being increasingly thought of as one of the most innovative and original Bible interpreters of the medieval period. In the 80s, Uriel Simon, in his illuminating PhD dissertation, I'm not sure if this book was originally a PhD dissertation. Yes? No, so it was a book. Okay, so in his...
It was a book.
I wanted to say, but just the one which was published, but no. Anyhow, he thoroughly studied the concept of a biblical Mudawwin in Yefet's commentary on Psalms, showing how it served as an important tool in the exeget's analysis of the historical process behind the formation of this biblical book. And this book was translated into English. Bruno Chiesa studied Yefet's commentary on Ecclesiastes in an attempt to demonstrate the instability of transmission of Yefet's oeuvre, and by doing so to disprove the theory of the alleged two recension of his exegetical works, inspired in Chiesa's opinion by numerous additions and expansion made by later copyists. And this theory of two recension was initially suggested by Poznański and later on accepted by the scholars. And it was, I think, the first one to reject this view was Haggai ben Shammai, and Chiesa just brought further arguments against this once commonly accepted view. These almost unprecedented analytical endeavors heralded a breakthrough in the study of Karaism as a whole, and thus Yefet, his role and importance as an exeget as well. The major impetus behind the recent efflorescence in the development of a scholarly discipline was the reopening of Russian libraries to Western scholars. As a result, many forgotten or underestimating Karaite authors were rediscovered, and many works considered lost until then were recovered. And Jeffrey Kahn was among the first scholars who utilized manuscripts from the Firkovich collections in his important reconstructions of a Karaite transliteration system of the Hebrew Bible, and in his work on the early and classical Karaite grammatical traditions. In these groundbreaking works, Kahn illuminated the Jerusalem Karaites' innovative linguistic notions and also highlighted the profound connection between grammar and exegesis in the Karaite understanding of the Bible. This led in turn to a new appreciation of certain aspects of Yefet's exegetical works. Accordingly, during the past decades, we have witnessed growing interest in this outstanding exegetes, and among other scholars, Meira Poliak charted out the idiosyncratic features of the Karaite translation tradition of the Bible in her illuminating PhD dissertation, which was significantly expanded into a book. This book offered a comparative structural study of various Karaite translations, giving a most prominent place to Yefet's works. Specific aspects of Yefet's translation methodology were also discussed in different articles. Furthermore, in a number of significant publications, Poliak endeavored to reappraise Yefet's achievements against the backdrop of contemporary Karaite exegesis, disproving this quotation which I showed you in the beginning, that the Rabbanites built mighty on the flimsy Karaite foundations. Her edited work, Karaite Judaism, A Guide to its History and Literary Sources, most relevant for a study of Karaism as a whole, included an extensive chapter on trends in Karaite exegesis, particularly highlighting Yefet's innovative conceptions as a Bible exegete. In this and in several subsequent articles, Poliak explored Yefet's literary sensibilities as an exegete and his understanding of the Bible as literature, including his notions of biblical gapping and authorship. And in this may be found so far the most detailed analysis of this concept of the biblical mudawin. Poliak put stress on the literary nature and narrative functions of this concept in Yefet's works, showing how it served as a primary tool in his understanding of the Bible's formation as a text. Moreover, Meira Poliak and Eliezer Schlossbeck published an annotated Yefet's translation of the book of Obadiah and an edition and Hebrew translation of Yefet's commentary on Hosea, which is preceded by a long introduction containing an in-depth analysis of various aspects of Yefet's exegetical undertaking. And this analysis, along with a joint article on the diverse methods of interpretation employed by Yefet in his introduction to the Minor Prophet, constitutes one of the most significant and extensive attempts thus far published to analyze Yefet's approach to the Bible in terms of his exegetical concepts and methods. In addition, Yefet was also a major focus of several articles by Yoram Erder, which dealt with certain philosophical, theological, and polemical facets of the exegete's commentaries on Exodus and Psalms. He also used Yefet's works as an important source text for his as far unpublished PhD dissertation on certain temporal notions of early Karaite halacha, and in his illuminating study on the Karaite monas of Zion, which is currently being translated into English. He also authored a couple of articles in which he heavily relied on Yefet's text while discussing different halachic and ideological notions of the early Karaites. At the turn of the 20th century, we witnessed an unprecedented efflorescence of a scholarly interest in Yefet and studies dedicated specifically to him and his exegesis. Daniel Frank, for example, utilized Yefet as a paramount and exemplary point of reference for his extensive research on Karaite exegesis, which was published in a series of very important articles that were subsequently incorporated into a book. The author explicitly states at the beginning of the book, and I quote, "If the story has a hero, it must be Yefet ben Eli." The additional advantage of his perspective is that Frank's work includes tentative editions of selected passages from Yefet's Bible commentaries. It's a full section at the end of his book. Another important contribution of the scholar to the study of Yefet is his landmark article on the limits of Karaite scripturalism, in which he demonstrated that against the commonly acknowledged opinion, the exegete was willing to press midrashic explanations into service, insofar as they were not contradicted by reason and could be sustained through scripture. And Yefet is again the protagonist, and tentative editions and translations of selected passages from his commentary of various biblical books are included. Or is it only on Genesis? Maybe. I'm sorry. Daniel Lasker also made frequent use of Yefet's commentaries when scrutinizing certain aspects of Karaite philosophy, theology, and its influence on later rabbinic thought, such as articles on the relation between Karaites and Maimonides and Karaites and Yehuda Halevi. In addition, a number of articles by Adrian Schenker, Shimon Stobel, and most importantly a book in German by Friedman Eisler were devoted specifically to Yefet and his various commentaries on Torah, Daniel, Psalms, and the diverse subjects they addressed, like Messianism or geography. Notabene, in one of his articles, Adrian Schenker announced that he is preparing, together with Yosef Alobaidi, an edition and French translation of Yefet's commentary on the first book of Psalms, to the best of my knowledge so far unpublished. This ever-growing interest in Yefet and his exegetical achievements also resulted in a new wave of editions. Sarah Strumsa, together with Sagit Budbul, edited and translated into Hebrew his commentary on Genesis 1:1-5. Budbul also edited and translated into Hebrew Yefet's entire commentary on the Scroll of Ruth. Ofer Livne Kafri published a critical edition Hebrew translation of a fragment of his commentary Habakkuk. Yosef Alobaid included a portion from Yefet's commentary on Isaiah in his book, and Tzvi Avni edited and translated into Hebrew the exeget's interpretation of Balaam poetic verses. At about the same time, Yitzhak Avishur edited a reworked version of Yefet's translation of Isaiah and Jeremiah, whereas Yosef Yaron published a new English translation of Yefet's commentaries on Daniel and Nahum. Moreover, Maciej Tomar from the University of Warsaw edited all of Yefet's commentary on the Book of Amos in his PhD dissertation, so far unpublished. He also wrote 2 articles in Polish on Yefet's commentary on this book. Later on, Meirav Nadler-Akirov completed her doctoral dissertation on Yefet's commentary on Amos 1-4, and if I'm not mistaken, she's now working on the edition of the entire text. Recently, Michael Wexler devoted 2 articles to the fragments of Yefet's translation and commentary on the Book of Proverbs. Both articles include critical edition and English translation of the selected portions of his commentary, of Yefet's commentary. As part of his doctoral research project, he edited and translated into English Yefet's commentary on the Scroll of Esther. This work has been significantly expanded into a book whose extensive introduction presents a most interesting analysis of the diversity of Yefet's exegetical sources and the philosophies that influenced him, inter alia that of the Mu'tazila, as well as the technique he employed in his translation and commentary on the Book of Esther. Last but not least, together with Meira Poliak, he is currently co-editing an important publication series entitled Karaite Text and Studies, commissioned by Brill. And in this series have appeared so far Yefet's commentary on Esther and Bibliographia Karaitica, which has been discussed yesterday. In this period as well, more dissertations were devoted specifically to Yefet. Fiona Bloomfield's PhD dissertation dealt with a translation exegetical technique employed by Yefet in his commentary on the Book of Ruth. Miriam Goldstein authored several important articles followed by the doctoral dissertation in which she scrutinized some of Yefet's exegetical methods either independently or as a relevant point of reference for the study of other Karaite exegetes. Her illuminating dissertation has recently been adapted into a book, and you have it in the exposition. Most recently, Jessica Andrews translated into English and studied Yefet's commentary on Jonah as part of her master thesis, and she is now working on this translation, adapting it into article. In addition, Joshua Sabih edited Yefet's translation of Jeremiah, whereas Ilana Sasson completed her doctoral dissertation on his commentary on Proverbs, presenting a most interesting study of diverse aspects of his hermeneutics, including his theological notions and polemical overtones present in his commentary. At about the same time, Yosef Alobaidi translated into English Yefet's commentary on the Song of Songs, whereas Yair Zoran prepared a new edition of Yefet's commentary on Obadiah. Now, after devoting a number of years to the study of Yefet, also my book is about to appear. It's focused on Yefet's commentary on Abraham's cycle. Currently, work in progress. Kees de Vrek is preparing together with me an edition of Yefet's commentary on Zechariah, and Ilana Sasson is preparing the entire commentary of Yefet on the book of Proverbs, with English translation. In addition, James Robinson is editing and translating into English his commentary on the entire book of Ecclesiastes. All these editions are to be published in the aforementioned series Karaite Text and Studies. Finally, the bibliographical articles by Giuliano Tamani are still of importance. They provide a list of Yefet's commentaries extant in Western European libraries, excluding the Firkovich collections. Nevertheless, much of the manuscript materials from the Firkovich collections have been updated in the comprehensive electronic catalog Aleph in the Institute of Makrof and Hebrew Manuscripts at the Jewish National and University Library. Last but not least, an important sample catalog of Yefet's commentaries on Genesis in the Firkovich collection was compiled by David Skler and Efrat Batat. Conclusions. Notwithstanding the fact, I shouldn't do that. Notwithstanding the fact that for a long time Yefet remained forgotten, he is now and overall by far the most studied medieval interpreter of scripture of the golden age of Karaite exegesis. Nevertheless, as you could see, many of the scholarly works devoted to him have been prepared as part of bachelor's, master's, or PhD research projects and unfortunately remained unpublished. You have the full bibliography in your handouts. Over time, together with gradually growing interest in Yefet, we witnessed a change in the scholar's approach to him and assessment of his achievements. From the very biased opinions typical of the studies conducted in the second half of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, to the very positive evaluation of Yefet's oeuvre, usually expressed in the second half of the 20th century. And here we come to this inconsistent or incoherent aspect of Birnbaum studies. He expressed a bit immoderate opinion about Yefet and his influence on later exegesis when he expressed a statement to the effect that, and I quote, "One is almost tempted to believe that there would be little left of Ezra and Kimhi if we were to discard from their respective Bible commentaries what was earlier uttered by their eminent forerunner, the now relatively obscure and forgotten Yefet." Kind of extreme. And in your handouts you have a rather generalized table of so far published works of Yefet with a reference to the bibliography. Of course, it's rather really generalized because many editions include also studies, many studies include tentative editions, and many studies relate to more than one biblical book, so I just classified them in a simplified way. But generally speaking, subjects of research and studies of different biblical books. Despite the growing interest in Yefet and his exegetical enterprise as a whole, all of his works have not been given the same amount of attention. In general, editions and studies devoted to his commentaries on shorter narrative texts, such as Ruth or Esther, and what the Christian Bible refers to as wisdom books, Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes, outweighed those that analyze his interpretation of longer books of the Bible pertaining to these genres, like Pentateuch, Psalm, or Job, which are more rare. In other words, the longer the text is, the less likely that it has been edited and thoroughly analyzed. For example, Yefet's vast commentary on the Pentateuch is still not well attended. Outside of short fragments tentatively published in various articles, only minuscule parts of this large composition have been critically edited up to now. Similarly, only few very important, like those presented by Meira Poliak, attempts have been made to analyze it, even selectively, and even more so to focus on this large composition as the main subject of an entire study. Of course, it is, I'm again generalizing because the book of Genesis, it's much more attended than any other book of the Pentateuch. So it's the same quantitative rule applies to Yefet's commentaries of prophets as well. Whereas those dealing with the minor prophets appear to be very popular with scholars, commentaries on Hosea, Yoel, Amos, Obadiah, and possibly Jonah were edited either in the entirety or only part as many as 4 times. His interpretations of the major prophets, especially Isaiah and Ezekiel, have hardly been given serious attention. Studies focusing on the exegete's interpretation of a legislative portion of Scripture, such as those in Leviticus and Numbers, are even more rare. Yoram's studies are but an exception. While nothing or almost nothing has ever been written or published about his commentaries on most of the scriptural texts that the Christian call historical books. I'm using this Christian denomination because it's exactly these portions that were ignored by scholars. That is to say, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. We don't have neither edition nor studies. Therefore, even the most rudimentary research on Yefet's interpretation of these books is a major desideratum. Now, FOTSI of research, studies of different aspects of Yefet's works. A relatively large number of scholars, especially in recent years, have focused on certain aspects of Yefet biblical commentaries, conducting in-depth examination of the exegete's rationalistic, literal, contextual approach, which indeed predominates in most of his exegetical compositions, while paying special attention to his innovative historical, grammatical, literary insight, as well as his translation technique. And here are studies by Maria Poliak, Michael Wexler, Miriam Goldstein, as well as myself, and as yet unpublished dissertation by Fiona Bloomfield, Meiraf Adler-Akiraf, Ilana Sasson, Jessica Andrews. This thriving area of research contrasts sharply with a rather modest number of studies devoted to Yefet's non-literal allegorical interpretations, as well as his messianic concepts of the approaching end of history and the war of Gog and Magog. And here, say for a book by Eisler, we have still the most substantial analysis of his issues was made over half a century ago by Neftali Wider and more recently by Yoram Erder. Although Yefet is not the main hero of the studies, it is in the forefront of a more recent research by Daniel Frank. An apt example of a general tendency discernible in the study of Yefet's non-literal interpretation of Scripture emerges from a scrutiny of a scholarly attention devoted to his commentary on the Song of Songs. It was edited at first by Jung in part and subsequently by Bargès in its entirety, translated into English by Alobaidi and partially also by Yoel Rice Menuhin, yet only selectively analyzed in depth, and this by other scholars, by Yoram Erder and Daniel Frank. Similarly, Yefet's translation and commentary on Jeremiah was the subject of 3 separate studies by Ventkos, Avishur, and Sabir. All of them included critical editions of selected portion of his text, but neither of them focused on Yefet's allegorical interpretations of the messianic visions present in these biblical books. And there is a question of 2 covenants allegorically explained by Yefet in this book, and it has not been addressed. Currently, Kies de Vreugd intends to respond to this desideratum by devoting the analytical part of his study to the exegete's concept of a Messiah and the war expected at the end of the days. To conclude, really, last paragraph. We are in the fortunate position of having most of Yefet's compositions identified and at our disposal, preserved, discovered, or recovered from Russian libraries after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Furthermore, most of us have relatively easy access to these abundant sources available on macrofilm in the National and University Library in Jerusalem. Probably thanks, at least in part, to the ever-increasing availability of Yefet's works, in recent years there has been a growing interest in this exceptional exegete and his unparalleled achievements. Taking into account not only the diversity, richness, and sheer size of the materials he left behind, but also the comprehensiveness and compendium-like nature of his commentaries, as well as the genuineness and originality of his own ideas, we can only hope that one day Yefet will deservedly become a separate discipline of study, as Saadia Gaon and Maimonides did. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tour de force. Let me just add 2 bibliographical references. First of all, according to Philip Miller, Birnbaum's work on Hosea, how should I say it so I won't be sued, was strongly influenced by Marwick, or rather that perhaps Marwick was more the author than Birnbaum. So when you deduce both Birnbaum and Marwick as 2 different views, it might be just one view. And in the Encyclopedia Judaica, first edition, when it says editors, it just means it came from Encyclopedia Ivrit. So you have to check who wrote the article in Encyclopedia Ivrit to see what it is. The editors does not mean the editors. It means that's okay. Any other quick comments? We're running a little bit late, but go on.
I would like to add that from the point of view that he was the compiler, from the point of view of halachic issue, we refer to these Karaite sages as commentators, but they were also leaders, and they understand the repercussion of their commentators from the point of view of halacha. So what I found in Yefet Ben Eli, that he didn't hesitate to show some options when he is relying to halacha, not only his view, but at the same time, he would not go according to the pshat if it will break his idea of what a Kabbalah should do from the halachic point of view. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marzena. It's really illuminating, not only in terms of Yefet, but I think also in terms of the development of Jewish studies. In general, what you've given us is a kind of insight into many changes that have occurred on a much wider sphere. And I just wanted to add that I have heard an oral comment made by not myself, but someone whom I rely on told me of this comment, which I think is very insightful as to the development of Jewish studies and Karaite studies in general, made by Gershom Shalom, when he was asked why he doesn't deal with Karaite materials at all and doesn't relate to them in his entire magnum opus on medieval Jewish thinking and Kabbalah, but generally speaking. And his answer, according to this scholar, whom I think I trust in referring to his view, was that מחקר הקראות הוא משעמם ולא פורה, ולכן לא צריך לעסוק בו. So it's very interesting, considering the place in which we stand today, and probably Yefet, when you look at it from the perspective of biblical exegesis, is probably one of the commentators of the Middle Ages who's been analyzed much more than any other commentator. You wonder about the tendencies and the tendaciousness, indeed, that underlies such comments that are based on absolutely no knowledge of the sources themselves, and certainly not of the Judeo-Arabic sources that were then, even then, available to people like Gershom Shalom. So this has been very insightful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marzena, for a very interesting talk. It's I really like what you did here in terms of pointing out things that, all of us should realize, but really saying, a little bit of a new also to us around the table. And it's interesting. There's a little contradiction between the two parts in a way, because one would think the shorter texts have gained more attention, and when one looks at the minor prophets, there's certainly much non-literal and allegorical aspects to be looked at there, yet nonetheless we have all tended to be more interested in the literal, contextual, and the rational. So,
yeah, but there are much more, I think there are much more editions than studies still.
More editions than studies in general,
Jennifer?
I know we're running quite short of time, but I'd just like to reiterate what Meira and also Miriam was saying, that I think this wonderful presentation you gave that does give us a lot of insight into putting into real perspective Jewish studies, in the sense that it reminds me very much when I started working on my grammatical text. There was sort of a bit of a polemic I've always felt going about who was the first grammarian, and I felt there was more to it than pure objectivity. There was almost a sense, and it sort of relates to this issue about how original Yefet was as well. This issue of who was the first, who was the most innovative. And there was, always felt there was a reluctance to accept the fact that the Karaite could have actually preceded Sadia. And I think if there is this shift we can have now in Jewish studies, getting away from this sort of tendentiousness, I think this is the major sort of breakthrough, the new age of Karaite studies, I think. So.
I don't think there's a debate as to who the first student of Karaite grammar is.